You mean I have to make it to where other people can understand me? It's a sad truth that at some point in our lives, we're going to have to stop talking only to ourselves, and we're going to have to start talking to other people. And this means that the type of writing we do when we decide we need to start talking to other people means we have to start thinking of other people's needs. And that should permeate how you think of language. How can you make your language as clear as possible so other people can know what's going on? Clarity in language is a really good thing. Here's the thing. The better we are at talking, the better we are at speaking, the larger our vocabulary is. And that's great if we're always talking to people who also have a large vocabulary and have the same level of depth. But that's not the people we should be writing for. We want to reach as broad of an audience as possible. So that means making great pains to try to keep our language in an area that everyone who's reading can easily understand. So here are a few things to avoid. First, jargon. Jargon is language specific to your field. If I'm in an academic environment talking to other English teachers, we're more likely to talk about kind of things that English teachers do and use words like pedagogy. In the real world, people don't know what pedagogy is. If you're talking within your group, an engineer talking to other engineers, doctor talking to other doctors, you might be able to let the large specific words slip. But otherwise, it tends to have a certain effect of making everything just harder for the layperson to understand. And if you're trying to get as broad as possible, jargon works against you. Don't believe me? Let's watch this.
Mummy, Daddy, where do babies come from?
Well, sweetie, when Mummy and Daddy synergise with each other very, very much, Mummy grants Daddy an open door policy in order to further enhance the possibility of cross-cultural pollination.
Mummy and Daddy remove from their structures any moratoriums which would otherwise prevent an inadvertent merger, and they diarise summits as often as commercially possible.
Yeah, of course there are a matrix of factors which determine the extent to which these summits can be determined to be a success.
Oh yes, actually I could not agree more. In many cases the KPI of Mummy's edification is often removed altogether in a unilateral management decision characterised as the cost of doing business despite brand promises to the contrary.
Well, the costs associated with summits are a two-way street, sweetie. Of course, Dad did have to give up cycling even though his reserves were optimal. They were optimal.
If the summit is successful in relation to the procreational core objective, within 9 calendar months you can expect a yield of at least 1 baby.
I thought you just had 6.
If you are sick of the way we talk business and want to communicate in a way that's more genuine, then join me. Head to jargonfreefridays.com and invite your colleagues to do the same. It's time to get real.
To people who aren't intimately familiar with the field, jargon can almost always sound like you are trying to avoid talking about the thing you're talking about, trying to obfuscate it, trying to make it less impactful, which, particularly when we're writing towards the general public, this is the last thing we need to do. And I'd argue that even within certain fields, the jargon will get in the way and just make it seem like you're not really talking about the things you are talking about. Some words that tend to get used as jargon and make lots of people's brains shut down. Paradigm shift. This has a very specific meaning to how scientific revolutions work, but it tends to get applied to things that don't come close to fitting that. Moving forward, calling somebody a rock star, unless you're actually talking about a rock star. Nobody's ever used this in relation to me, though. Not without laughing heavily. Anyway, you ever hear anyone talking about taking stuff to the next level? You ever hear anyone describing themselves as results-oriented? Would you hire someone who wasn't results-oriented? Give 100%. Ugh. Pre-plan. I don't know how you plan before planning. Thinking outside the box makes me want to put people inside a box and then mail them to somewhere far away from me. Synergize. Synergize has a very specific meaning. However, it tends to get used to, as I said, make meaning less obvious to people. A perfect storm. Again, has a very specific meaning, but tends to get used to just make people's brains shrink. So, jargon, probably not a good thing if you want to be able to communicate to as large of a number of people as possible. Another thing that doesn't work for you? Idioms. Idioms are a group of words established by usage as having a meaning not deductible from those of the individual words. Lots of words in that one. Let's make this clear. When you drink a product from the Coca-Cola company or the Pepsi company, what do you call it? In this area, pop is a perfectly acceptable way. I come from a Coke region, whereas I honestly heard people say, "Would you like a Coke? What kind of Coke do you have?" "Well, we only have Pepsi." Coke was the generic term where I grew up. Soda is what it's called in another region. Pop is very definitely an idiom, and you see it's located towards a very specific part of the country where it dominates as the term. If you're not from that area, the first time I was working in a restaurant, someone asked for a pop, I had no idea what they're talking about. You need to think about, is your language specific to your cultural background, or is it something that someone else can actually understand? And if you want to communicate outside your group, you should work towards stuff that's more universal. Some other idioms. As cool as a cucumber. Cucumbers in themselves aren't necessarily cool. This is one that's dependent on cultural language. Paper jam. Letting your mind wander. Being blue in the face. Kicking the bucket. There are tons and tons of them. Some of them might seem obvious to you. Some of them seem obvious to me. But that's a sign that we're in the culture where that's a normal, accepted phrase. People outside that culture probably aren't going to understand what the hell we're talking about. The third type of word choice you should avoid in writing are cliches. Cliches are a phrase or an opinion that is overused and betrays a lack of original thought. All in due time, grasp me at straws, shoot the moon, love is blind. For Pete's sake, fighting like cats or dogs, you know these things. Words that almost seem like they're just filling up space. They're so overused, and they're so saturated in our culture that your brain tends to shut off for them. The problem with cliches isn't just that they're boring. When someone says something like, "it just makes my blood boil," it doesn't really even add any color from just saying, "it makes me angry." It just bores you. But it's not just a matter of being boring. A term that's come in usage lately is thought-terminating cliché, when clichés tend to get used specifically so we don't have to think about it anymore. Let's agree to disagree is a stupid statement because it just says, well, there's no point in arguing anymore, so let's just not bother with it. And you see thought-terminating clichés all the time. To pick an example from recent history, in the midst of a rising COVID death toll, then President Donald Trump says, "It is what it is." Is there a more thought-terminating cliche than "it is what it is"? It basically says, well, it's happening. We can't do anything about it, so let's think about something else. Can you continue to think at all after hearing something like that? Not really. That's not what it's designed for. All these eliminating cliches, eliminating jargons, eliminating idioms are things that will very much help your language be clear and make your language be easy to understand. And because of the world we're living in, computers, connectivity, international business, knowing that you might end up encountering people from different backgrounds of you, if you keep your language as clear and as easy to understand as possible, you'll be able to make your audience as broad as humanly possible. And the broader your audience, the more people you can communicate with. And that's what we're doing here, isn't it? Now, if you were just the village blacksmith or something like this wouldn't be so much of a concern for you. But the world we live in means that your customers aren't necessarily just going to be the people who live down the street. We're going to be interacting with people from all walks of life. I mean, if you look at it honestly, even back in the days where there were village blacksmiths and things like that, everyone wasn't just like you then either. But the problem I don't really think it's a problem. The situation is much different now. We have technology, we have computers, we have phones, we have the ability to interact with people from as wide of a surrounding as humanly possible, which means we're going to get more and more diverse people. Writing isn't about just shoving your ideas out. It's about communicating, and communicating means you gotta take other people's perspectives and other people's needs into account. You can't reach them if they can't understand what the hell you're talking about now, can you? That's good. See you next video.